Ashina Elite, Jinsuke Saze, and long-armed Centipede Giraffe. In many ways, the game feels like sometime before shipping, someone snuck into FromSoft and jiggled the boss order around until these two bosses, slotted for the tutorial, ended up displayed somewhere in the middle of the game. And this is the subject of today's video, to just prove this. Sekiro would have been better served to have these two bosses appear closer to the beginning, for they are bosses almost perfectly designed to teach players the most important lessons for what to expect in the rest of the game, about blocking, parrying, and posture. So, let us begin. A part of this is about design, about expectations. If you see a shiny object, you know you should pick it up. If you see a silhouette on a wall, you know you should lean against it. And if you see a bulky mountain of a man in armor, you know he will probably have a good deal of health and defense. The way things look inform what we think they can do. This is the heart of design. And it is in the same way that the fact that Sekiro is a shinobi comes with certain expectations. Think of it this way. Imagine a shinobi. Now imagine everything that entails. An agile, quick character that leans on stealth and subterfuge, armed with a versatile prosthetic loaded with hidden tools. If you were to guess, would you imagine that this character's primary means of defense would be A. Dodging and jumping, or B. Blocking and parrying? Considering the character in question, it seems more likely that dodging and jumping would be the primary, with blocking and parrying more situational and desperate. But this isn't really what you get with Sekiro, because when you look at the core combat, what it prioritizes, Sekiro is a shinobi that fights like a samurai. You parry and block attacks more often than dodging. When you meet an enemy armed with an absolute beast of a sword, visual design-wise this screams, you are not supposed to get hit by this weapon. You are supposed to avoid this weapon. But gameplay-wise, the correct option is not to dodge and jump out of the way. In fact, you are actively punished for taking that option. If players spam dodges and jumps, they just get hit by the many tracking moves that are Sekiro's bread and butter. Let's take a moment to unpack this, because Sekiro's tracking attacks are important. It's one of the main reasons that blocking and parrying is so core to the combat in Sekiro, while jumping and dodging is situational. Most enemy moves in Sekiro have a high degree of tracking. They home in on the player like nobody's business. You jump or you dodge, and you find that the enemy is rotating to continue to face you. The weapon's arc magically magnetized to your orange body. And this is because you are not supposed to dodge or jump these moves. If a move has a high degree of tracking, it's the game's way of telling you, block this, parry this. Because Sekiro's dodges and jumps are not like the dodge rolling in Dark Souls. If you try to chain together multiple jumps and dodges in Sekiro, you just get hit. The moves just don't have the same iframes. They lock you into lengthy animations that are long enough that the enemy has enough time to just attack you again. It's just not a spammable option. And this is because dodging and jumping are not meant to be the focus. They are meant to be situational options. It is blocking and parrying, and posture by extension, that serve as the pivot around which most of Sekiro's combat revolves. Huge swords, mighty halberds, and even giant monkey swipes. Sekiro can block them all. In fact, Sekiro is supposed to block them all, sometimes with what looks like a twig in comparison. And to be clear, this is okay. It's okay for the game to be designed this way. You can have a shinobi whose defense is more about blocking and parrying rather than jumping or dodging, who blocks almost every blow with his mighty toothpick. But let's not kid ourselves and call it anything other than counterintuitive. This kind of choice requires recognizing that it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle. You're going to have to teach players to seed the right expectations. It's important, because nothing about the way things look in Sekiro suggests that that is how the mechanics will operate. And when difficulty is less about developing the skill necessary to proceed, and more about lacking key information about how the game works, it can feel frustrating, even arbitrary. And the real kicker here is, the game had the tools to avoid this. A core tool they could have introduced to see just this kind of expectation. To teach players this counterintuitive lesson on the importance of blocking and parrying early on in the experience. Bosses. Two bosses in particular. Ashina Elite, Jinsuke Saze, and Long Arm Centipede Giraffe. Let's start with our boy in blue. Jinsuke Saze has basically one attack. He starts sheathed, then unleashes a chain of 2 quick draw attacks. That's it. It's that unbelievably simple. 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. It is the most obvious tell of all time because the guy just spams the one attack. And he blocks every attack you throw at him when he's not doing his thing. The player is playing Jinsuke's game, and Jinsuke has all day. So the player has to wait, to watch, to learn, and so obtains a valuable and important lesson. The player learns that they have to anticipate and notice cues, that they have to predict and parry successfully. They notice how simply blocking will result in chip damage. They notice how much posture damage is built up when they successfully time and pull off the counter. They notice how parrying the first hit does not stop the second hit from coming, and they notice that a second hit comes every time, and that it happens so fast that there is no way to react to it. So they learn to anticipate it. And in learning these lessons, the player racks up enough posture damage to death blow and win the encounter. It's simple. It's clean. In fact, it's downright elegant in its efficiency. And the same can be said of Long Arm Centipede Giraffe. Long Arm Centipede Giraffe uses a long chain of unceasing attacks with his claws. Occasionally, Centipede also throws in a couple of sweeps into the mix for players to jump, but it's the first attack that's important. The long chain of swipes. Players quickly realize they cannot block through the onslaught. They simply do not possess enough posture. They cannot jump and dodge the attacks. Centipede attacks you rapidly. He closes distance faster than you can get away. The area is enclosed and claustrophobic, meaning you can't find the space necessary to avoid him, which leaves only one option. Players are forced into a position where they must learn to parry and deflect a chain of attacks. Because in a rather beautiful way, not only is it the only way to survive the onslaught of attacks, it is the only way to rack up enough posture damage to win the fight. The player is practically beaten over the head with a lesson of how parrying is at once a fantastic defensive and offensive option. The whole fight works as a wonderfully crafted lesson teaching one of the fundamental pillars of Sekiro's gameplay. The counterintuitive way that Sekiro's combat revolves around blocking and parrying, and it's just thrown in randomly somewhere in the middle of the game. And this is why the boss order looks to be such a missed opportunity. Jinsuke and Centipede are instrumental in helping players understand what kind of game Sekiro is. They see the right expectations. How blocking and parrying are one of your most important tools in combat. How long chains of sustained attacks, and attacks with clearly telegraphed long windups, are both offensive and defensive opportunities. How dodges and jumping are more often situational for specific contextual attacks, and will be punished if used indiscriminately. And how racking up posture damage through proper anticipation and parrying is one of the chief methods of bringing down your foes. These are the lessons that the early bosses of Sekiro do not do an adequate job of teaching. Lapses of knowledge that create walls of arbitrary difficulty that are simply unnecessary. And this is just the bosses themselves, the specifics of the fights. There are other reasons, separate from what actually happens in these encounters, that make them a better fit as early game bosses. Because it's not just what happens in these fights, it's what doesn't happen in these fights that work as another point in their favor. For Jinsuke and Centipede neatly sidestep a problem that plagues the early game of Sekiro. The boss mook factor. The boss mook factor is very simple. Many of the early game bosses are placed in areas with mooks that are close enough to the bosses in question that they are aggroed and become a part of the fight if ignored. Generally speaking, the encounters allow for drawing out and picking off some of the mooks before starting the boss in earnest. It even gives you specific tools well suited for this purpose. But it quickly becomes annoying, as after every attempt, players must redo the process of pulling and picking off enemies before starting the boss. And if you don't do this, if you try and fight the boss and the mooks at the same time, then a part of the fight becomes about running around in a mad dash trying to kill off their mooks while avoiding the boss. This proves to be particularly aggravating, as Sekiro is ill-suited for tackling combat with multiple enemies at a time. For several reasons, really. Because of the way the game works, you can only lock onto one enemy at a time, and the game is built around fighting while locked on. The second analog stick is reserved for switching lock-on targets rather than moving the camera to get a better sense of the many enemies, which limits your visibility of the battle. And pairing attacks from multiple directions is a frustrating process, as attacks designed to be blocked layer on top of each other and continue to hit the player. But as you tackle these fights, you come to accept it. You accept that this is going to be a part of the difficulty. That a portion of Sekiro's bosses are going to be about dealing with mooks and bosses simultaneously. Because that's what these encounters are like. That's what the game is teaching you to expect. And then, inexplicably, this process is absent after the first half of the game. Suddenly, bosses are almost always entirely isolated, placed in private arena enclaves for the player to tackle at their pleasure. There are exceptions, of course. Tokujiro the Glutton, aka Jizo's doppelganger, has his monkey friends that you can kill on a cliff that he can't reach. There is also Lone Shadow Vilehand and Shume Masaji Oniwa, two late game encounters that have the potential to be multiple enemy fights. But even these few bosses have conveniently unaggroed enemies that can be instantly backstabbed to return it to a one-on-one fight. For most of the game, the trend holds true. After the first few bosses, the boss mook mechanic just disappears. If there are enemy mooks between the spawning point and the boss encounter, the game makes it a mostly trivial process to simply run and rappel past almost all of them before attempting the boss again. Even Snake Eyes Shirafuji, who is practically surrounded by aggroed snipers, is conspicuously placed on a little island of mountain that is completely blocked off from the rest of the enemies. The game consciously puts this element of fights off to the side. It is a mechanic the early part of the game primes you to expect, before, just like that, it's gone. And the difference is staggering. Suddenly, every loss means a quick jaunt to a retry, as opposed to an extended multiple-minute session of cleaning up fodder enemies between attempts. The game stops getting in your way. Fighting bosses becomes a smoother, more educational process. For when losing is less punishing, when there's less friction between failed attempts, then there's more room for experimentation. Players are encouraged to try again and again, iterating faster, learning faster, and simply getting better at the game. So, that's boss mooks. We've covered why Jinsuke and Centipede work well as tutorial bosses, and we covered how they don't suffer from the boss mook factor. But how do they stack up against the actual early game bosses? Which boss slot, if any, would they take? How do they fare as experiences, boss fight against boss fight? Well, in considering these questions, one boss in particular sticks out as a point of comparison. Chained Ogre. Because Chained Ogre is somewhat special among Sekiro's early game roster. For if Jinsuke and Centipede stick out as great tutorial bosses that showcase exactly how Sekiro diverges from the previous Souls games, Chained Ogre is notable in how he feels like stepping straight back into those older games. Because Chained Ogre does not block. There's little to no focus on the posture, blocking, and parrying side of the game here. If anything, they are actively discouraged by the boss's huge lunges, grabs, and unblockable moves. Which means players lean on dodging, jumping, and spacing for this fight. Fighting him becomes more about keeping your distance and waiting out his larger swingy moves, before swooping in to get a few hits in during a vulnerable period. When players try to apply the lessons learned in the Chained Ogre fight, they end up employing tactics that simply don't work for a majority of the encounters in the game. They find that all they have obtained are bad habits, because the rest of Sekiro's bosses do block. If you try to only dodge and run away from the boss, Sekiro's bosses tend to punish the player with tracking attacks, and even when they don't, and staying away is feasible, waiting out such moves from a distance generally does not work. The window of opportunity in which players can deal damage is too small, so players have to get closer to properly deal damage, and being close enough to the boss to punish the small damage windows generally means you are also in range of the boss's attacks, which means you have to block and parry when necessary. You have to dodge and jump when necessary. Because if you don't, if you're too far away, you generally can't deal damage when the opportunity presents itself. If Chained Ogre represents a sort of battle of attrition, then most of the other bosses represent battles of active attrition. Players have to engage directly with the boss's moveset. They have to respond and deal with attacks at a range in which they pose an active threat. They cannot simply steer completely clear of the boss, only swooping in when the boss uses its most high commitment moves. Except with Chained Ogre. Chained Ogre does not block. So with Chained Ogre, you can do that. Players can run and jump around, keeping their distance and attacking only when safe. Tactics that might have worked well in other Souls games, but simply don't hold up for most of Sekiro. The boss simply teaches the wrong lessons. Now, there is a case to be made that Chained Ogre is supposed to be more about learning to use the shinobi prosthetics, that the key of the encounter is supposed to be in obtaining and using either the firecrackers or flame vent in order to defeat him. But the shinobi prosthetics are limited, tied to a consumable resource that makes him seem subsidiary to the main combat from a design perspective. The prosthetics are never quite fundamental to the combat in the same way parrying and posture is. Even within this fight, it is not essential, functioning more as a way to get a decent chunk of free damage rather than winning the encounter outright. And even if we buy this, it seems a wasted opportunity. This early boss fight would have been better served to teach something more important, especially when there are fundamental counterintuitive mechanics that need to be taught and reinforced. The fight is messy in terms of seeding expectations, and the lessons it does impart range from less necessary to downright harmful for getting through most of the game, which is fine enough for a one-off, but seems a wasted opportunity considering the other bosses that could have taken the spot, especially when Jinsuke and Centipede are just there, waiting in the later half of the game, neatly packaged lessons that are more than ready to teach the player. And finally, to top this all off, let's take a moment here to address a counterpoint, a certain caveat that should be addressed here. There is a case to be made that shuffling and moving bosses around is no small change, especially in a FromSoft game. This is a company that is known for putting care into their placement of enemies and bosses. Traditionally, the locations certain objects and enemies can be found are supposed to have story implications. It is one of the main vehicles through which FromSoft likes to engage in indirect storytelling, and it's one of the reasons the worlds in which these games take place in tend to feel so rich and consistent. It's supposed to matter that there are monkeys here as opposed to monkeys there. That being said, considering that almost the whole of the game takes place in Ashina, it wouldn't have been too much of a stretch to have Ashina Elite appear in one of the many Ashina-affiliated places in the game, especially Hirata Estate, considering there is already a blue guy there that even fights Juzo with you. And while Centipede might be harder to find a place for early in the game, the mechanical lesson to be learned seems well worth the consideration of finding a way to include the boss early. You can place care into where these bosses are placed, while still having the freedom to change the boss order. There are reasonable, consistent ways that these bosses could have been seeded into the game early, in ways that make sense within the context of the game. It wouldn't have been a small thing, but it seems like it would have been a problem worth solving. And that's it. Basically, that's the whole point of the video. This is why Ashina Elite, Jinsuke Saze, and the long-armed Centipede Giraffe would have been better in the place of the existing early game bosses. They are focused, more tutorial-styled experiences well suited for teaching newer players. If Sekiro threw these few bosses earlier into the game, it would have done a lot more to help players understand the more counterintuitive ways that the game works, about how much of the game revolves around blocking and parrying. It would have meant less frustrated players, less stuck players, and less players who simply bounce off the game, who leave because the game simply doesn't do a good enough job of teaching you until you are hours upon hours into the experience. And it's a real shame, because when everything clicks, when you finally understand the game, when you reach the endgame encounters fully armed with knowledge of all the mechanics, when you're finally in a fair fight, Sekiro is an absolute joy to play.